Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Institute for Disability Research Policy and Practice Early Intervention ECHO. We are thrilled to have you today. My name is Janelle Preston. I'm the project coordinator. If you will take a minute and put your name and contact information into the chat, that just again helps us get to know each other and know who's on the calls with us. We are recording today's session. By participating in that, you are consenting to be recorded. So don't hit that leave button, but if you have really strong feelings about that, I guess you can go ahead and leave. If you've never joined an echo session today, we have some components of an echo session. So we have our subject matter expert. Today we are thrilled to have Rebecca Foster present to us about sensory play. We have had this year-long and continuing to have a year-long series. Oh my word, series. I'm glad I'm not the presenter today, Rebecca. I can't talk. So series around typical development. So we're thrilled to continue on with that. And then we have case discussions, problems of practice, whatever you guys want to call it, where we all discuss solutions and ideas of how to improve this case. Kate Bennington is sharing a case with us today that she's working on. And that's where our professional networking happens. We all have great resources and ideas. Everybody on this call has so much knowledge, and to be able to share and learn from each other is just a great way to continue to enhance our skills as a clinician. We love interaction. So if you feel comfortable and are willing to turn on your cameras, it again helps us see each other in this virtual world. We love those questions. If you want to put those into chat, Kurt Phillips monitors that for us and will ensure that your questions get answered. We love that interaction. Again, there's just so many people that are on this call that have knowledge and expertise, and so sharing that with everybody. Again, if you just make sure that you introduce yourself, we love your cameras on. It helps us see who's on the call so that we're not staring at these black squares. If you do have a question and you're coming off mute, please be sure to introduce yourself and keep your questions brief and on topic. We do talk about families or clients that we serve, so make sure that you de-identify the information. If you have any questions about that, you can reach out to one of our hub members. They all have an asterisk or will quickly have an asterisk in front of their name so that they are easier to find in chat instead of having to scroll through everybody. Throughout today's session, we will be dropping a survey. The survey is what we use to take back to our funders to show the amazing work that these echoes do. And that's how we send out those credit for attendance. So thank you to everybody who filled those out. We really do take the information that is shared in those surveys and create the curriculum for these echo sessions. It's how we came up with this idea to do typical development because a lot of you guys had shared those on your surveys. So thank you to everybody who completes those. We store everything on our Canvas page. Our Canvas page stores the recordings, the PowerPoints, handouts, all the case recommendations. So I know there's lots of times we talk about a particular case, but can think of 5 other kids on our caseload that those strategies and ideas will work for. So you are free to also go back and download those and utilize all of those resources. And if you want access to our Canvas page, just email earlyecho@usu.edu and we will get you set up with that. We love case studies. So if you, case study, problem of practice, whatever you want to call it that makes it sound like it's not as nerve-wracking to present a case, we'd love to be able to share that with everybody and be able to get recommendations and resources that are specific to your case. Like I said, utilizing everybody on this call because there's so much knowledge and expertise. So if you're interested in presenting a case, please reach out to Early Echo at usu.edu and we will get you set up on the schedule. If you're nervous about presenting a case and just want that presented for you, reach out to us and we will be glad to share your case so that your questions can get answered. We do have social media where we post things, resources that are shared with us, things about any echo related things happening here at the Institute for Disability. So if you've not done so, take a minute and follow us. And then I am going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn the time over to Rebecca.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, it looks like it's sharing the whole thing. Hang on. Try that again. Okay, does that look how it should?
Do from beginning and then it will.
Okay,
Yep, perfect.
perfect. All right. So, hi everyone. I am Rebecca Foster, and I'm an occupational therapist working with the Minot Infant Development Early Intervention Program. And I've been in OT for a long time and have worked in a variety of settings. Just really excited just to have the conversation today about sensory processing and sensory development throughout those early first couple of years. Get my mouse in the right place. Okay. So our learning objectives today are going to talk about what the sensory system includes, kind of break it down by all the different pieces. And then we'll talk a little bit about development in those first 3 years. So birth to 12 months, 12 to 24 months, and then 2 to 3 years. We'll talk about some red flags that we want to keep an eye open for as early intervention providers. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. And I will mention I did have a coworker who was going to present with me today, and she was not able to last minute. And so she's given me her notes. So if I look like I'm reading notes from time to time, looking at her information to make sure I get some of her excellent tidbits, that's what I'm doing. So we'll just dive in. So when you went to school as a kid, you probably learned about the five senses. And what we learn as we dive into early childhood development is that there are definitely more than five senses. And today we're going to talk about the hearing or auditory system. We'll talk about vision, touch or tactile, oral, and olfactory. So we're going to kind of combine that oral piece with the sense of smell. And then we'll talk about proprioception, vestibular, and interoception, which are the senses that we typically don't learn about in our childhood science classes, but they are really important to childhood development. And I want to point out too, as we're talking, the three senses that we consider as OTs to be really foundational to development would be that taste, touch or tactile, proprioception, and vestibular. And my goal really for you to gather as we go through all this information and talk about some of those milestones is I really want you to be able to see how All of these senses are foundational to development. So the skills that you'll see when we get to some of those milestones should really reflect other things that we're assessing, whether it's motor skills or cognitive skills, feeding and self-help. It should all kind of come together and really demonstrate how that sensory system is so foundational for childhood development. The other thing I want to point out too is that the sensory system is very individualized. So we all have our sensory preferences, and I know that we hear the term neurodivergent a lot, and I feel like when I look around at the adults I know that maybe refer to themselves that way, they're often people that maybe have more sensory differences than what we might consider to be typical. But I would just encourage you to be thinking about your own sensory preferences today as we go through this, and maybe how they influence your participation in different activities in your life. So maybe you're a person that does not like tags in your clothing or can't stand to wear a turtleneck because it feels too tight around your neck. I think most of us on this call live somewhere where we have to deal with winter driving, and maybe you're somebody that would turn off the radio or any music or sound that you have when you're dealing with poor road conditions, just so that you can cut out some of the sensory input that you're taking in to be able to focus on another sensory system, which would be your vision. Some people are super picky about the foods they eat, even as adults. Some people, we always have a good time in the fall. Our team always does a pumpkin carving thing, and then we have somewhere in the community in one of the parks that has businesses and organizations put the pumpkins. And so we always tease the couple of members of our early intervention team who cannot stand to scoop out the inside of a pumpkin. And so those are like little things that we know about ourselves that we as adults can structure our day, our eating patterns, all the things about our life to accommodate those preferences. And so when we think about children developing, just to keep in those things in the back of your mind, that it's okay to have some differences. We all function day to day in our world. It's just that when kids are little, they don't have the choice or control to meet those preferences all the time. And so then we want to think about, when does it cross over into something that is interfering with participation? It's maybe delaying development in a certain area. And then those are the things that we can talk about as those red flags. Okay. So the first system we're going to talk about is the auditory system. And even though it's not one of those three foundational systems, it is incredibly important. And our sensory receptors relay sound, rhythm, vibration, and create those sound waves that our brain then interprets in a meaningful way for language, for music, to alert us to things in the environment that could be a safety risk or need to get our attention. Pitch, loudness, and localization are important aspects of creating meaning out of the auditory input that we receive and that gets processed by our brains. And one of the interesting tidbits that I learned as I was researching for this presentation that either I didn't know or I had forgotten, but I do know that you can hear sound in the womb. So when a child is born, they already recognize their parents' voices. And so just how critical that is to the bonding experience for a child is to have that recognizable voice. And then another thing that Christy, my partner, was reminding me of too is that music, when you hear music, it actually activates all parts of your brain. And so when we think about how effective music is as a learning tool for children and for language development, keep that in the back of your mind, that it activates all parts of the child's brain. And so everything's engaged in that learning and communication experience, and even motor experience if you're adding actions in. The touch or tactile system. So we have touch receptors in our skin. They're sensory receptors, and they respond to sensations of pressure, vibration, pain, temperature, and movement. And that the two places of the body that would have the most amount of sensory receptors would be your hands, definitely the palms of your hands, but the tops of your hands as well. And then your face also has the most sensory receptors. So when we are working on those discrimination skills or thinking about kids that maybe have vision needs and things where we need to keep in mind that we're invading their space and we're entering the most vulnerable space, which would be the face if we're working on something related to feeding. Remember how many sensory receptors are in those parts of the body, and that we want to make sure that we're not overwhelming them by entering that space without permission or without letting them know what we're doing. So touch can be discriminatory, and it gives us information about the type of touch. It could be light touch, it could be firm pressure, deep pressure. It can be protective, which would be more reflexive. So the type of touch response that you have when you touch a hot stove, your body is responding before you even have time to cognitively process what's going on. So the tactile system is kind of complex, and so that's why there's so much involved in how it relates to overall development. And then we have the sense of vision. So we have receptors in our eyes that respond to light and darkness, to color and movement. It gives us the ability to connect sights to sounds, to be able to focus on faces, make that social connection with people in our environment, as well as to focus on objects and attach meaning to language, to prompt responses, and to identify characteristics about the world around us. And of course, vision is a critical element for the development of eye-hand coordination, visual perceptual skills, and spatial relationships between our bodies and the environment around us. And so you'll see when we jump forward to the sense of proprioception, how the vision sense can connect to that spatial awareness that develops with other parts of our body as well. Oral and olfactory. So oral function is initially reflexive. Babies are born with that rooting reflex, that ability to suck, and it becomes intertwined with a complex, controlled series of fine motor actions that increase awareness of the mouth and tongue and lips as they get older. And the sense of taste is initiated with a sense of smell. And the sense of smell actually is something that starts in the womb. So that's kind of a wild thing to think about, that babies can already start to smell when they're in the womb. And again, just reminds us of how it's kind of like a primitive system that's really connected to things like memory, as well as that sense of human bonding and quality of life. And when you look at research, it's actually something that is a negative indicator towards the end of a life. If an elderly person loses their sense of smell, it really impacts their quality of life and can be an indicator of maybe longevity. So the olfactory system is super important. And the oral system is also equally important as far as leading to, of course, thriving and wellness for eating. But just that exploration using the mouth is the first way that babies start to learn about their world, because they're starting with putting their hands in their mouth, and then they start to bring objects to their mouth to explore. They use the mouthing of objects to move that gag reflex toward the back of their mouth so that they can handle foods and the spoon in their mouth as they get older and they're prepping for eating. And so all the sensory pieces that go into that increasing their ability to be aware and have control over the muscles, as well as accept new sensations, new flavors, new textures. So really important piece of their sensory development. And then we have proprioception. So sensory input is received through the muscles and tendons and joints through movement and pressure. So if you think about when you're pulling on something, your joints are kind of distracting or pulling apart. And then when you're pushing on something, your joints are being pushed together. So as a child is maybe on its tummy and learning to push up on its arms, it's getting a lot of sensory input through its arms and shoulders. And so this is how the body starts to learn about position of one body part in relation to another, starting to be aware of their body in space. They start to notice that these body parts that are kind of waving around them are actually attached, and that they can start to have some control over it. And then as we mature, just that idea of grading of movements, postural stability, and emotional security. So if you think about a toddler learning to drink from an open cup, a lot of times parents are kind of afraid to work on that skill because they don't want the mess associated with it. But really, part of that is that proprioceptive sense of them starting to be aware of the weight of that cup with the liquid in it, and how that weight changes as the liquid is consumed, and then how to grade their movements as they bring that cup to their mouth and have to tip it. And all those pieces are related to that proprioceptive sense. You think about picking up oops. Okay, I think I just lost the screen share.
Try screen sharing again. I might have clicked something that took it off. I apologize. It moved too
Okay.
fast.
Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay, so another good example of proprioception is if you think about like a suitcase sitting next to somebody in the airport. As you would go to pick up that suitcase, you would unconsciously prepare your body to pick up something that is heavy. And if that suitcase were to be would be empty, you would probably grab it and be surprised at how easily you would lift that up because there would be no weight to it. So just thinking about how we unconsciously are grading our movements throughout the day, this is something that develops as that sense of proprioception develops for a child. And so the ways that we're going to see them working on that would be climbing, banging things, learning to jump, learning to climb, and all the things that kids do as they're actively playing. They're getting all that sensory input to their muscles, tendons, and joints. Okay, and then vestibular. This is another foundational sense. And this is related to the ear. So the sensory receptors inside your ear actually are what gives that information to your brain about where your head is in and your body is in space in relation to the ground. And sensory receptors give the brain information about balance, about movement, direction, and speed. And the example I like to think of is if you were watching TV or a movie and you were laying on the couch on your side, do you ever stop to think about how it is that you can still see the image in a vertical way, even though your head is sideways? Another example of how the vestibular system can impact us is if you've ever had vertigo and you go to get up and you're dizzy, or some people will even fall and lose their balance, and it's all connected to that inner ear system. And so this is one of the reasons it is so foundational, because it's what helps us have the ability to stand up and walk, sit upright on a chair, be able to keep our balance as we're moving throughout our environment. And it really gives us that sense of gravitational awareness and security. So, like being grounded. And one of the ways you'll see maybe a child that struggles with that a little bit is kids that don't like to be laid back to get their diaper changed or get their hair washed in the bathtub, kids that get anxious when they're lifted up off the ground. And so that's kind of that gravitational security that you might hear your OT on your team refer to. And it can really impact our sense of security moving throughout our world if that isn't in place. It also has a lot to do with our ability to use eye movements to track objects. So thinking about the visual attention that a child needs later on as they enter their school years to be able to shift their visual focus from looking at a smart board or something, a whiteboard, and then back to their worksheet at their desk, and just that ability to move back and forth and be able to visually track and use that visual attention is really related to the vestibular system. And I was going to note too, there's a research study that I put in the references at the end, but there was a study that was done kind of looking at some of the sensory features that would be connected or correlated with children that are at high risk for autism spectrum disorder. And the way they determined that was just some of the family history, maybe having siblings on the autism spectrum. And what they learned was, I was trying to find my notes on it. So the toddlers that were studied for sensory features that could be early signs of ASD, they had less mature oral sensory processing abilities, but they also had difficulty with processing vestibular information and kind of like a hyperactive response or overreactive response to vestibular and proprioceptive input. So it was kind of interesting to me how those three are so connected. And the vestibular system is really a big piece of that. And so when you see kiddos that struggle with those things, it's kind of like an early red flag to keep an eye on as you're working with families. And the study that was done on this was done on children who were 12 to 24 months old. So really kind of at that age where we're not doing a whole lot as far as screening or assessment yet, but definitely starting some screening is a good idea around that 15, 16 months of age. Okay, interoception. Now, I'm an old OT. I graduated with my bachelor degree in 1997, if that gives you any idea. And we didn't even have the term interoception in as part of our learning back then. And so we kind of lumped all the things that we think of as interoception into the other areas of sensory development. But there's been a lot of research done on it over the last few years, and it's really become an area of focus, not just in child development, but for adults with a variety of disabilities. So people with multiple sclerosis, people with Alzheimer's, and really looking at how that interoception system can be impacted when it's not functioning optimally. So interoception is the ability to detect the presence or absence of a stimulus within the body, either conscious or unconscious. So it's really that internal system that helps us keep a balance or homeostasis, and it involves processing signals for hunger, pain, temperature, bladder control, breathing, even heart rate is included in that. And it also includes hormone and immune system responses. So we maybe don't think of it as interoception, but as we're working with children and monitoring their development and asking families questions about, potty training readiness, that's a big one in that first couple of years that would really relate strongly to the sense of interoception. Another one is, in early intervention, we might work with families who have a child who have had feeding difficulties, and so they've had a G tube, or maybe initially had a nasogastric tube for feeding. And for some of these babies, it is hard for them to develop that sense of hunger awareness as well as the sense of satiety. And so as they get older, in addition to working on just being able to accept things orally by mouth, oftentimes we also have to work on helping them like consciously work on teaching their child how to recognize those signals of hunger and satiety. And I think of one little guy that I had who did really well developmentally overall, but initially as a newborn, he needed a G tube because he just couldn't keep anything down, and they could not find any biological, physiological reason for this. And so he ended up with a G tube. And so as he got older, we were really focused on making sure he was getting all the oral experiences he could get so that when it came time to start working on oral feeding, he was ready for it. But then we realized as he was eating food, he couldn't tell when he was hungry. And so mom had to start watching like those emotional signals and teaching him like, man, when you feel angry, this is what that means. And then the other big thing for him was not being able to recognize when he was full. And so mom actually started to use Alexa. And so when she could see he'd had a lot of food, but he would get upset if he could still see there was food in a serving bowl or in a pot in the kitchen. She would use Alexa to play a song to help him transition away from mealtime and to help teach him when it was time to be done. And so it was just something that they had to be deliberate about and teach him how to recognize when his body was done. So those are just like a couple of little examples to be thinking about as we work on child development, that children do develop the ability to recognize those body signals as they get older, but sometimes we have to be really deliberate about it and talk about it and use some verbiage to help them learn some of those signals that they don't necessarily catch on independently. So we'll talk about a couple milestones that we can watch for. And again, after just kind of talking about each of the sensory areas, you should be able to see by the milestones how it all starts to come together. So at the birth to 12 months range, initially they really calm with movement, with rocking, bouncing, swaying. They can calm to sounds and smells. Babies typically have a preference for the sound of their mother's voice, but they may also have a preference for dad's voice pretty early on as well. And so those are the things that they're using to calm and regulate their system. A typically developing infant should enjoy a variety of positions, but they may also develop preferences early on. Some babies like to be turned away from mom and so that they can see what's going on in the world. And then other babies might really like to snuggle in. And so babies can develop their own preferences pretty early on for what feels comforting for them or what they enjoy. But oftentimes you'll notice when you're working with a toddler and you're talking about some of the red flags, you might end up having a conversation with a parent about how, they were just never a snuggly baby. Like they didn't like to be held and snuggled or rocked. And those were things that were not regulating for that baby. And so sometimes a parent can look back and identify that those maybe were some little red flags from the get-go that they didn't understand or recognize at the time. Tummy time is critical for development of postural control as well as visual motor integration. And we could go through like a whole list just on tummy time alone and all the benefits, but just to know like the sensory input that they get during tummy time really has a huge impact on their development, and something to always be encouraging parents to work on with their babies. motor control and spatial awareness for reaching, grasping, rolling, sitting, and standing. So that comes from that combination of being able to get that sensory input through their joints and muscles, to be able to tolerate the different movements that come with that vestibular system development, and then even just what they can tolerate through the sensory receptors on their hands as they're playing and touching and pushing up on the floor and pushing on different objects. And then oral motor coordination for that suck, swallow, breathe rhythm. Again, initially it's going to be more reflexive, but then later on, around 4 months of age, they start to develop more volitional control for sucking and then later chewing. And then oral exploration with their hands, initially starting with the hands, then toys, and then later on foods. So then if you look at that chart, so at 2 to 4 months, their eyes should be able to start tracking together. You should see less of the eyes kind of doing their own thing. And at 4 to 6 months, you're going to see hands and objects coming to mouth. By 6 to 9 months, maybe banging objects on a surface. And then 9 to 12 months, developing depth perception. So just looking at that little chart alone, you can see how the eye-hand coordination all starts to come together just from those some of those basic milestones.
Hey, Becca,
Yes.
there's a question in the chat. It says, can you share some alternative tummy time positions to help bridge the gap until the child is willing to be on the floor?
Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of you could throw some ideas into that chat too if you wanted to, but there's lots of ways to work on tummy time without putting a child on the floor. So a parent could lay on the couch and put baby on their chest or just reclining somewhat. Carrying them in that football hold where their tummy is across your forearm is another good way. And that's actually an excellent position for activating the muscles of the neck and the back and kind of those righting responses for babies. So that's a really good one. You could put them on like the couch and be right in front of them face to face, as long as you're right there to keep them safe. Sometimes people will use like a boppy pillow and kind of prop them on there. And, something to think about is, what are the reasons that they're having a hard time tolerating tummy time? Keeping an eye on maybe the head control, making sure they aren't developing some kind of torticollis. And so there's just an imbalance in the muscles of the neck that are making it difficult for them. Making sure that they have good range of motion of their neck to be able to have the freedom to move their head to the side as they start to get stronger. Maybe it's a gastrointestinal issue contributing to some discomfort. So just really talking through with parents, maybe all the things that could be related to their discomfort of tummy time. And then just remind them that tummy time isn't just being on the floor, but it can be in a variety of positions.
I was going to say, Rebecca, also, I'm a physical therapist by profession. One of the things that I found is that I use the analogy of doing a push-up off of the floor or off of the wall. I can go up against a wall and be on an angle, and doing that push-up is pretty easy. And you progressively, the more horizontal you get, the more difficult that push-up becomes. And with kids, I see that same thing, that head control when they're born, their head is such a huge percentage of their body weight. It'd be like us having 50-pound heads, right? And it's so difficult for them to lift it. So to your point about being on the couch, a lot of times I'll put them with their elbows on the arm of the couch, and then I'll actually tuck their knees up underneath them. So they're kind of in a knees and elbows position over the couch, but they're on this angle versus this angle when they're on the floor. A lot of times I found that kids are a lot more amenable to that until they get stronger. And then I kind of use that technique where we go a little bit more and more horizontal along. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the percentage of their body weight that their head is would be equivalent to, us having 50 to 70-pound heads and trying to lift it up. So I try to explain that to the parents. They go, oh, okay, that makes sense why they wouldn't want to be right on the floor. So I'll usually start, like you said, on the belly, on the couch, kind of propped up over a pillow, something like that, to let them develop the strength. And then as they develop it, put them in that more and more challenging position.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Kurt. Yeah, I think the head is like 25% of their body weight when they're first born, which is pretty wild to think about. Um, and then yeah, just that idea of a gravity reduced. That's kind of what we're talking about is reducing the push of gravity as their muscles are developing, and as they get stronger, then you can challenge them more with different positions. Another thing too, if there's siblings in the home, that's always a great motivator, because if that baby can be face to face with a sibling, playing and talking to them, like that can be really enjoyable for them. And then also using the opportunity to put other stimulating things in front of them, like the black and white fold out books are a great tool to use for tummy time, because you can kind of to put it around them so that as they're learning to turn and control their head, kind of whichever direction they're looking, they have something to look at. And so that can be a really good tool to have available for families. Okay, 12 to 24 months. So at this point, they've developed a lot more postural control, not only for sitting on the ground, but they're starting to be able to have that postural control for sitting on other surfaces, for standing, walking, climbing on and off various surfaces. That's one where we're asking them, can they climb up on the sofa? And then once they're up there, can they get back off safely? And so they're just really learning how to manage their body on different surfaces. And, I didn't mention it earlier, but when we were talking about proprioception and the vestibular system and how those can impact you, as a former school OT, one of the things that would be something that would perk up my ears is when a teacher would be starting to have concerns about a student in their classroom, and they would mention things like this child would fall off their chair for no reason whatsoever. You're like, oh, well, there's a reason, but it wasn't because somebody pushed them off, but just kind of that postural control. You should be able to see that in that 12 to 24 months where they're able to start to sit on some different surfaces and get off and on a small stool or chair. Okay, and then exploration of a variety of food, liquid, environmental textures. And so by that, I mean like being able to tolerate walking on grass and bare feet, those kinds of things. The emergence of body spatial awareness and motor control for those early self-help skills. So feeding themselves with a spoon, learning to use an open cup, taking off a couple clothing items. And then the emergence of awareness of some of those internal body signals. So being able to start to identify when they're hungry, when they're thirsty. And a good time to kind of be thinking about that is if you're the speech therapist asking about their communication, or if you're assessing their self-help skills and you're asking, do they have a way of letting you know if they're hungry or thirsty? Are they pointing at things? Are they bringing you their empty cup? And are they using any words or signs to ask for more? So those are ways that you can actually identify, oh, yep, they are starting to have some internal awareness of when they're hungry and thirsty. When kids learn to say owie or ouch, they're starting to recognize when they're having feelings of pain. And they're not going to be able to recognize necessarily like a tummy ache or a sore throat, but more of like a scrape on the knee. They're going to be able to identify that as an owie. And talking about those things are ways to keep working on the development of recognizing those internal body signals of pain. And then in 12 to 24 month range, we're going to start to be able to sort objects by color and shape, and then taking things apart and putting them back together. So they should start to have like that visual perception skill, as well as a controlled grasp and release to be able to stack a couple of blocks by 12 to 15 months. But then later on in that 18 to 24 months, maybe more control to be able to take some Duplo blocks and pull them apart and put them back together and build a bigger tower with those. And then for self-help, they should be able to start help washing their hands. They should be able to start having more control if they're scribbling on paper, starting to maybe imitate some simple strokes. So that's that 12 to 24-month range. And then at 24 to 36 months, that's when we're really going to start to have more awareness of that interoceptive piece of things where they're starting to notice when they need to go potty. I would say one of the earliest signs that I ask about is, if they're starting to go hide and seek privacy, if they're going to have a bowel movement in their diaper, that's a big one. And then they'll start to have growing independence with dressing, washing, brushing teeth, really be able to start to have some independence with those. They should at this age enjoy participation in sensory play, such as Play-Doh, sand play, water play, doing painting, coloring. Again, every kid's going to have some preferences, but given repeated exposure, you should see that they should start to enjoy those things and be willing to participate in those activities. And then they should have a growing attention span for learning focused activities. So that is related to the sensory system, is that ability to sustain focus. And so you should start to see that if you're working with them on puzzles or like a color ring stacker, things like that. They should be able to stick with you for that task. And then you're going to see language skills developing to be able to start express emotion and participate in some self-regulation strategies. So that could be something like, you've taught the child that, if they're struggling, they're having a meltdown or they're about to have a meltdown, teaching them where they can go in their environment to take a break, whether it's a beanbag chair or find their blanket and go sit on the couch with a book or go to their room. But they should be able to start participating in that and maybe show some independence from time to time to be able to use some self-regulation strategies that are simple and readily available to them. And then spatial awareness, postural control, motor development, that's all reflected in kind of that motor skill development to be able to run, to jump, even be able to jump off like a low step or the bottom step of a climbing structure at the park. They should be developing ball skills for kicking and throwing and maybe starting to learn how to catch a bigger ball. They should be able to propel and steer a riding toy, not necessarily a tricycle yet, but they should definitely be able to propel and steer just a riding toy they can use with their feet. And then they should be able to enjoy, climb up and get on a slide and go down sitting up and enjoy that. And they should also enjoy some swinging at the park. So when we start to think about red flags, kids that struggle with any of those things, then we start to think a little bit more about their sensory system. So then the milestone chart again, taking off clothing items, choosing by color. So really supporting that independence by being able to make some choices in their world. Scribbling and drawing some simple shapes. So they should be able to imitate or copy a circle and some simple lines. And then just kind of that motor control and proprioceptive awareness to be able to have like a pitcher with a bit of water in it and pour that into a cup. And I would say a lot of our families it would never even occur to them to maybe give that opportunity to their child because they're already struggling with giving them the independence to use an open cup. But then I always remind them, like, if they have cups in the bathtub, what are they doing? Oh, they're pouring water back and forth. And so that's that combination of proprioceptive and fine motor control. Okay, so we'll just talk for a minute about some red flags. And there's a lot of red flags. One thing I will mention is that, well, a couple of things. The first thing is a lot of times if a child has some sensory differences that maybe are interfering with some participation or some development of their daily living skills, people immediately jump to autism. And so I usually tell families, you can have some sensory differences and not have autism, but most kids on the autism spectrum do have sensory challenges. And the way the DSM-5 has structured it with the different levels of autism spectrum disorder, they've kind of lumped sensory into that part where they talk about the repetitive and restrictive behavior patterns. And so it's not a specific section in there to diagnose specifically around sensory processing, but that is included in that. And so most kids on the autism spectrum do have sensory related challenges. The other thing I will mention too is with the research that I've done, they would say about 30% of kids on the autism spectrum also have some type of motor dysfunction. So, in addition to maybe some repetitive behaviors, maybe some sensory challenges related to eating or sleeping, you can also see it with their motor skills. So they might be clumsy. They might be kids that parents describe as tripping over their own feet, or maybe they'll say, they're lazy because they tire so quickly because they have low muscle tone. And so they don't have the ability to participate in activity the way a typical child would. And so they're not lazy. There's some other underlying reason. And I think Kristen talked about that when she talked about motor skill development back in January, but kids aren't lazy. Kids are motivated to interact with their environment when they're typically developing. And so if you're seeing just some interesting motor patterns that maybe would indicate, maybe low muscle tone. And so then they're not going to process some of that proprioceptive input the same way they would if they had muscle tone more typical of a child. So those are some things to look for too. But just a reminder that not every kid with some sensory differences is on the autism spectrum, but it's definitely one of those red flags that you should be aware of and looking at, and kind of looking at the big picture about what else is going on with the child. So when it comes to sensory processing, you want to ask yourself, is the child's ability to process sensory input from their environment, whether it's eating or going outside and playing in the yard, is it things that keeps them from doing daily living activities? So eating, wearing appropriate clothing, are they terrible sleepers? Have they always been terrible sleepers? Do they struggle with playing? And is that because they struggle with playing with things with their hands because of different textures, or because they can't access it because of their motor skills or low muscle tone? And are they not gaining skills at the rate that we would expect? Does the child's responses to different experiences cause the family to avoid situations that we would consider typical? So are these families that would never take their child to the store with them to get groceries or to go to Target? Do they avoid the park because they're concerned about fleeing? Or maybe they would say, well, if we go to the park, all they do is run around on the grass, but they don't want to go on the play structures at all, and they don't like the swing or the slide. So maybe they just kind of avoid the park. And do they avoid family gatherings because it's just too stressful, because everybody's judging the fact that their kid won't eat what's available at the family gathering, or because they're having a meltdown because they're overstimulated and overwhelmed by the the different setting and all the people and the smells and the sounds. And so maybe they just avoid those bigger family gatherings. And maybe they never take their kids to restaurants because their child can't sit for that long and wait. And then, they are restricted in what they'll eat, and that gets tricky. And so maybe a restaurant experience is just too stressful for them. So if you start to hear that and like you see the pattern, that this is a family that's really isolated because it's too stressful to go out into the community, then that would be a pretty big red flag. And then, does the child experience unusually high levels of anxiety, frequent meltdowns, or social differences? We know with the age group that we work with, it's typical to experience meltdowns, some communication frustration, but if there are meltdowns that don't resolve within a typical time period expected for that age, then maybe you want to take a deeper look. So there's lots of different red flags. And the thing I would say is make sure that if you are working with an early intervention team, you utilize those OTs on your team to really just, even if they're not a consultant for a particular child, just feel free to pick their brains and say, mom mentioned this at our last couple visits, or I've noticed this, and what do you think? And maybe just have them kind of talk through some things with you. And then you can decide if maybe that EI needs to talk about a review so that they can add some OT consults or just get some extra support. But in summary, how a child's brain organizes sensory information, basically it affects everything. It affects their learning, their movement, their communication, their behavior, their emotional development. It affects their appetite, their sleep patterns. And so a child that is typically developing, you may not think about that sensory piece of it very much, other than to just try to offer typical experiences that kids can safely participate in at the various ages. But when there are challenges, that we just have to be deliberate. And I'm not going to dive into like the whole sensory integration approach, but if you feel like a child needs more intensive therapy, then that's probably something outside the coach and consult model of early intervention. But there is a lot we can do, and we know that the brain is so plastic at those early ages that the more we expose them to and kind of help develop those pathways in the brain to organize and accept some of the sensory information that maybe is difficult for them or they're under responsive to, then we can help modulate and really make an impact on their neurological development at that early age. So I think the takeaway for me to give to you would be just to know that it does impact everything, and that as you're coaching parents and working with parents, there's a lot you can do as an early intervention provider to really set the child up for success, to give parents really practical strategies they can implement into their daily routines, and just really help them to be able to maybe start to enjoy and participate in some of the activities that were difficult for them. Okay, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity today, and I'm gonna stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions. Oh, and I have to do a shout out to our team because I bugged a couple of our staff to share pictures of their own children with me to pop into the slideshow today.
Hey, I'm not seeing any questions in chat. We'll give it another few seconds to see if anybody comes off mute. Great presentation, by the way, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Okay, so,
Can I just make
oh,
a comment real
yep,
quick before we shift? I just want to speak from a PT standpoint. When I started, I had no real training in sensory or any of that type of stuff. It makes such a huge difference for me as a PT, and I would imagine for a lot of the other disciplines, if there's a way that we can help modulate those oversensitive or hypersensitive areas. Because if I go in and I've got a kid that has hypersensitivity to any one of these areas that Rebecca's talked about today, it's really hard to get them into focus and work with what I want to work with. So I've learned a ton from OTs, and this was a great presentation, Rebecca, about how that sensory system really dictates what that kid will or won't do, right? If they're overstimulated, they're not going to eat. They're not going to try to get on all fours. They're not going to interact verbally because they're so focused on what their sensory system is telling them. I mean, we had a kid who hated having his shoes on before I knew any of this stuff. We would cram his feet into those shoes and he would just throw a fit for half an hour and he wouldn't do what we were hoping to do as a family. And had I known this stuff, we could have used some techniques to bring down that sensory system, get the shoes on, or use some other flip flop or something like that to get to do what we want to do. So I just want to speak to Rebecca and what a great job she did and how overarching the sensory system really is in every domain within early intervention. To be able to get an effective session in, I always start with sensory to bring it down if there's a high sensitivity so that then I can work, because if I don't, my session's gone to pod. So thank you, Rebecca. Great presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
all right. I'm going to turn the time over to Kate, who is sharing our case today.
Cool. Let me make sure this works. Does that look good?
Yep.
Okay. Cool. So, yeah, I'm Kate Bennington. I'm an OT. I work for the EI program in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I am actually gonna do it a little differently. I'm gonna be presenting kind of on 4 different kids that have similar sensory profiles that I just ultimately would love to get more ideas on how to support them. So since it is multiple kids, the background information isn't going to be too detailed, which I know for some, when we break out into breakout rooms, I think a common question we get is, I want more info. I need, I have more questions. So I am sorry to leave you hanging on that, but just some key points to know about the kids. They range from 18 months to 35 months, almost aging out of our program, one of them. A couple of them I have concerns for autism, and so we're addressing that and on various stages of referrals and screening and stuff. One child was premature but has done phenomenal since. And so there's not any major medical complications that we're worried with. Truly any of them, even the little guy with that has a history of HIE, he's doing pretty well developmentally. And then the other 2 kids have no significant health history. They just were referred because of language delays and mild gross motor delays. So that's
Kate, I'm going to just be the acronym please. What is HEIE?
Oh yeah, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Yes. The biggest concern for truly all these families is communication. And so they're working with different therapists to support language development as well. But I eventually was brought in as the OT to address the underlying sensory concerns that clearly are impacting their ability to access their language and communicate. Along with that, so yes, language development is and using words is the big concern for all of them, but also just getting their attention and their engagement to be able to learn and copy those words and sounds and things like that. So that's across the board, all of them working and focusing on that. And primary concern for parents is communication. With a couple of them, we are seeing a little more aggressive behavior. We are seeing hitting and biting specifically. And thinking about like what are all the causes of behavior, right? I do think a lot of it comes down to communication. It's effective just to hit, it stops the whole interaction. But I do think there's a little bit of a sensory component too, going and they like the feedback that they get. And so sometimes it doesn't seem just purely communication or frustration. It's just, hey, this feels good. And same with the biting for sure is just, hey, I just want to do this because it feels good, but can be really problematic, right, for kids and the parents. And then extended tantrums or kids just getting upset and having a hard time de-escalating once they are escalated. For these four kids, similar barriers where families, parents, super busy. So any suggestion of strategies, it's got to be simple and realistic with multiple kids, multiple parents working. Lots of them actually are with either at a daycare for a lot of the time, or their grandparents are their caregivers. And some of the grandparents I'm able to meet with, some of them I'm not able to meet with. But that is oftentimes challenging knowing how to get grandparents on board of ways that they can help. And so that is one of my questions. That third question, bulletin point, kind of focuses on that of how to get those heavy work activities, the high proprioceptive activities that Rebecca was talking about for caregivers who aren't as physically able to get down and roughhouse, which their kid clearly wants and needs and is, climbing all over them, trying to get that. But the grandparents have shared, I'm not able to do this, which is fair and realistic. So I would love more ideas on simple strategies, activities that you guys have done that have been helpful for families that aren't able to roughhouse as easily. Oh, and one of the little kids, so this first bulletin point, I'm seeing a lot of toe walking in a couple of the kids too. So I just would love ideas. It seems to be sensory related, right? And so ideas that you guys have used to help kids that are toe walking. And then ideas on that screaming and yelling. It's kind of a stimming vocal. They love the input that it brings. The sound of it, I think it's rewarding for them, but can be dysregulating for parents. So knowing how to meet parents' needs and the child's needs. If they could just yell all day long, I think they would be happy, but that's not realistic or reasonable. And then that last bulletin point is focused on how to get the caregiver buy-in on incorporating regular sensory play and understanding the benefits. I think a couple of the families I work with, they see that their child has high sensory needs and is a mover and a groover, wants more input of whatever it is, right? But don't understand that or don't have the buy-in yet that, hey, maybe if I intentionally implement kind of that sensory diet strategies, that it will help them. Other families, I feel like they're like, oh, just let the kid do what he wants, which is totally fine. But don't really see the value of being intentional about the sensory input that they get. And I think about several of these families that I know are living in small apartments. Their child's not able to get outside and play and get a lot of those sensory rich experiences that are beneficial for child development. And then I like going along with that, just ideas how to make it feel more doable. So it's not like, oh, we have to have this elaborate plan or these elaborate things that are helping my kids. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what you guys say. I have these kids, high sensory needs. They want more. So I need more ideas.
valid point, Kate, that you're talking about. We have these four kids that look pretty similar. I think that as you were talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, there's some kids on my caseload. I can't wait to get those ideas. There's one question before we go into breakout that Shelby asked. She said, disregard. Never mind. Disregard that. Okay.
She answered it. She's good.
Okay. All right. So we have a few minutes to just wrap up and hear one idea from each breakout group. So, Kate, I don't know who took notes.
Leo did, and he got cut off, so I'm honestly wanting to hear the tent idea.
Okay, Leo, share the
I,
tent idea.
I was just gonna say just to set up a tent in the living room and put in like pillows and like just make it a fun fort necessarily. And that hopefully would be easy on the grandparents because I'm also just thinking of the grandparents and lessening their workload. I think another suggestion from the breakout room was to just assure, I really like that somebody said that we just need to assure the family that sensory play doesn't just consist of expensive toys. Like you can make your own sensory toys out of the things you have in your home. So it's nice.
Great. Okay, Pat, your group. I don't know who took notes.
Emily did.
Emily.
Yeah, so we have a whole big long list of all these ideas that we got. Um, but one that I really liked is letting the child help with things that you're already doing. So like bringing in the groceries, they're gonna get some heavy work with that. Maybe putting cans on a shelf, moving books to a different bookshelf, unloading, loading the dishwasher or the dryer, things like that that you already have to do.
Great. All right, Kurt.
All right. Yeah, I took notes. One of the things we came to the realization I think that's important is sometimes this is on toe walking due to sensory related issues. Sometimes it's a tactile sensory issue. I don't like putting my heel down. I don't like walking on the grass. We've got to be aware of what the surfaces they're walking on, what kind of things that they are willing to do based on putting their feet on a solid surface. We also talked about that a lot of times it can be an anxiety type thing, that if it's a high stress environment, that can also cause them to be higher stress and go up onto their toes. So looking at what the environment looks like from a sensory standpoint. The weighted vest was one that has worked for me as a physical therapist with these kids, and we had somebody else also mention that. So those weighted vests sometimes can kind of help settle that sensory system and allow them to walk more flat-footed.
Great, wonderful ideas. Our group, I really loved this idea, the having a poster with facial expressions and having them be able to point to what they are feeling. So again, these will all be compiled, stored on our Canvas page, and shared with you, Kate, to be able to use. So just another plug for case studies. When you get it, you get a nice report of all of these recommendations. And I think Kate was a fantastic reminder of that. You know, we have a lot of kids that struggle with a lot of the same things. And so getting ideas around that helps all of us. Next month, we will have our session on trying to identify whether it's sensory or behavior. I think all of us had some behavior modification ideas in here as well as sensory. So our amazing Pat Boyle will be sharing that with us on August 5th. So enjoy your holiday. Maybe if you take a long weekend and have tomorrow off as well, or taking Monday, enjoy it all. Thank you.